Hello everyone, this is Pastor John Nays from Bridgepoint Church in Green Bay, Wisconsin, coming to you again with another section or another chapter out of the book of Revelation, the revelation of Jesus Christ. Today we'll be looking at chapter 11. I was hoping to get farther than that, but through my studies I discovered that chapters 12, 13, and 14 are all linked together. They're parenthetical. In other words, they have descriptions of what happens on the earth. It's not sequential. In other words, it's kind of stuck in to explain some things. So I'm going to try and do all of them together next week, and I will be broadcasting again next week, even though it's Christmas week. So I'll broadcast on Wednesday as normal, and hope you'll join me then as well. But we'll be taking a look at 12, 13, and 14, hopefully all three of them next week, although that's a lot of material, and I'll probably just skim the surface, but give you an idea of who the characters, and there are 7 main characters in those chapters, so I hope you'll tune in to take a look at them. Today we're going to look at the 2 witnesses and John's description of them in chapter 11, and I find this very interesting, and I hope that you do too, because it shows us the presence of God, the power of God, but just as importantly, maybe more importantly, the desire of God to continue to proclaim the gospel of Jesus Christ, to warn the people of the earth that they cannot keep living the way that they're living, that they need to recognize who God is in their lives and who God is on this earth. So let's take a look. I'm going to start with chapter 11, verse 1, and I won't be reading the entire chapter, but just some highlights that I've noted throughout. Chapter 11, verse 1. I was given a reed like a measuring rod and was told, go and measure the temple of God and the altar with its worshipers, but include the outer court. Do not measure it, because it is given to the Gentiles. They will trample on the holy city for 42 months. And I will appoint my 2 witnesses, and they will prophesy for 1260 days, clothed in sackcloth. They are the 2 olive trees and the 2 lampstands, and they stand before the Lord of the earth. If anyone tries to harm them, fire comes out from their mouths and devours their enemies. This is how anyone who wants to harm them must die. They have power to shut up the heavens so that it will not rain during the time of their prophesying. And they have power to turn the waters into blood and strike the earth with every kind of plague as often as they want. Now, there is a lot of speculation about who these 2 guys are, but let me first start with John given a measuring rod and saying, go measure the courts of God, the holy place and the Holy of Holies in particular, and saying these 2 things are set apart, or set out for God, and that's simply all this means. John sent to the temple and said, God said, go measure these things out, and that represents that God is saying, I'm measuring these out because this space belongs to me. And so, which is not unusual. It happened a few other times in Scripture, the book of Ezekiel, the book of Daniel. The same type of measuring rods are used. It's a rod about 10 feet long, give or take. And so it represents God's completeness, God's holiness, and how really no one measures up to him because no one's 10 feet tall. But also there's this idea that this belongs to the Lord and not to be toyed with or to be messed with. So John is sent out to measure them, and then we get this vision of these 2 witnesses, and they are 2 literal witnesses of the Lord. And they have great power, great ability to punish those who try to fight against them. It takes supernatural power, in other words, for these 2 men to stand in Jerusalem and let the world know that they're not measuring up. And I think that's why the measuring rod, or the God measuring that space, is really saying, look, the world doesn't measure up. And God's trying to warn them and say to them again, and isn't it amazing that God is still giving them a chance? The world has turned against him. The world has fought against him. But for the last 3.5 years of the Great Tribulation, there is God still again saying, listen to these prophets. Listen to my word. Take heed, because you don't want this to happen to you, and I don't want this to happen to you. And yet the hearts and the minds of men and women around the world are still shut off from him. And we're going to look at how that happens and why that happens, the false prophets and so on in the next 3 chapters of the book of Revelation. But there really is this hardness, this coldness to the very presence of God and who he is. And I was thinking about that as I was reading this, that in our world today, there are a lot of people who claim to be Christians or who call themselves believers in God, and yet their belief is so shallow that they can't even imagine a Christ who would judge this earth. They would look at the book of Revelation and they see all this disaster and destruction, and they can't wrap their minds around it because their vision of God, their understanding of God is so limited by what they've been told, or taking out only what they want to hear or want to believe. It's a very dangerous thing, and it's disastrous. It's disastrous for those who claim to believe and yet really don't believe, who claim to know Christ and really don't know him in totality. And this Christ, this Jesus, is the same person. He is the same one who is worthy to open the seals and pour out these judgments on the earth, the 7 trumpets that have sounded. He's the one who is able to do that. And so here we have the people of this earth still rejecting this God. Now, the interesting thing too about these 2 prophets is not only do they have supernatural power, the supernatural power is to protect themselves. The world can't overcome them, but it's also to judge those who come against them. So if you can envision the kingdoms of this world, and we'll get to that in a little bit, or the kingdom of this world fighting against these 2 prophets because they're standing up and proclaiming the gospel of Jesus Christ and the need for men and women to turn to God and to turn back from their sin or turn away from their sin and to turn to the Lord. When you see that happening in the book of Revelation, it's God again warning them again and again and again, look, you've got to turn to the Lord. And they keep rejecting him, and they send forth the powers that be to try and destroy these 2 witnesses, and are unable to, because they've been given supernatural powers to protect themselves, and that means destroy the enemy as well. The other thing we need to talk about just briefly is there's a lot of speculation about who these 2 witnesses are. And in being true to this passage, let me just say again, don't speculate. It is probably not Elijah or Moses or any of the Old Testament prophets, even though they possess the same powers that those prophets had. That doesn't mean that they're the same people. It's just the power of God manifest through these 2 witnesses, just like it was manifest through the prophets of old. Elijah had the power to call down fire from heaven. Moses called out the 7 plagues, and these 2 prophets have the same power, the same ability to call forth destruction. And the last 5 words of that passage just said, as often as they want. They could call down fire from heaven. They could pour out plagues upon the earth, turn water into blood. It was destructive. It was overwhelming. It was amazing. They could call on these kinds of plagues as often as they want. And I don't know why that stands out to me, but it really does say that these 2 men had an amazing ability. Now, at the end of the prophesying for 3.5 years, Satan, the great dragon, who is released out of the pit, out of the abyss, is released again, and he goes to war against these 2 prophets and kills them. They finally are killed. The world celebrates their death for 3.5 days, giving presents to one another, having parties. And I was thinking at Christmas time, it's kind of like, Christmas for them, giving presents to one another and rejoicing over the fact that these 2 voices have been silenced. Isn't that interesting and tragic? Tragic that the world still does not want to hear the reality of Christ, the reality that the church has been given to declare to the world that he is the Christ, the Son of the living God, and he's come to redeem and to save, and to reach out to those who are lost, to bring healing and help and restoration. And what a sad story that the world in the end still rejoices when that word, that voice, is silenced. But in verse 11 it goes on to say, "But after the 3.5 days, the breath of life from God entered them, and they stood on their feet, and terror struck those who saw them. Then they heard a loud voice from heaven saying to them, 'Come up here.' And they went up to heaven in a cloud, while their enemies looked on." After 3.5 days, they're resurrected from the dead. Catch this phraseology. After 3.5 days, the breath of life from God. The same description as in Genesis, when God knelt down in the earth, formed man in his image, and breathed life into him. The breath of life from God. And after they were resurrected from the dead, well, obviously the world who's watched all this is terrified. How in the world did these guys come to life? And then a voice calls them up into the heavenlies, and they're taken away from this earth. And it says that they were taken away while their enemies looked on. So the world is watching this, celebrating this, and all of a sudden, these two guys come back to life. God himself breathes life into them, and they're resurrected. They're taken up into heaven, and the world is stunned and terrified, I might add, but not enough to change their ways. The next few verses describe how they still rebel against the Lord. And it's just an awful picture of the heart of man. The capacity of humanity to reject the grace of God is absolutely stunning. So let's move on. So there's verse 15 says this: "The seventh angel sounded his trumpet." So here's the seventh trumpet. Hasn't been sounded yet, but here it comes. "And there were loud voices in heaven which said, 'The kingdom of the world has become the kingdom of our Lord and of his Messiah, and he will reign forever and ever. And he shall reign forever and ever.'" We all know that song. It's from the Messiah. One of the greatest songs probably ever written. And I love that song. "And he shall reign forever." Sorry, I didn't mean to sing. But it just comes over you, doesn't it? He shall reign forever and ever. The Son of God, the Messiah, will reign over the earth forever and ever. And this is a beautiful picture of God finally saying, "That's enough. That's enough. I've had enough of your rebellion. I've had enough of your looking away. I've had enough of your rejection. I've done everything within my power," which is massive. "I've done everything within my power to redeem you, to help you, to save you, to give you life, hope, joy, peace." It's Advent season. Love, joy, peace, hope, faith, all those things. The Christ has come. And yet the world continues to reject such a powerful truth and such a powerful life that we have as saints of God. And it says here, and as the seventh seal is open, and then we'll get into chapters 12, 13, and 14, as the seventh trumpet is sounded, that the kingdom of this world will become the kingdom of this Christ, or of this Messiah. The kingdom of this world. Now note that this is not the kingdoms of this world. The best manuscripts have it singular. In other words, God doesn't see nations, kingdoms. He sees this spiritual battle, this spiritual warfare of the kingdom of this world that fights against God, this world that doesn't love humanity like he does, this world who is keeping people under its thumb, this world that keeps people in darkness, this world that comes to destroy. This kingdom of this world will come to an end, and the Lord will reign forever and ever. That's great news, isn't it? The kingdom of this world will come to an end. And it's not all the kingdoms of this world. It is the kingdom of this world, the darkness of this world, whatever your description of it is, whatever the Bible tells you over and over again, darkness and Satan and Lucifer and the powers of and authorities that reign in the heaven, or that run in the heaven, and the battle that's happening there, that kingdom will fight against God until its very last breath. But in the end, it will have a last breath. And this Christ, this Messiah, will reign over all the earth. And he will bring humanity back to himself and redeem not just the people, but the planet itself. So that's my message for today. I hope you're enjoying this series, and we'll get back to it next week. And again, I'm not taking a week off from this, so I'll see you next week. Chapters 12, 13, and 14. We'll get as far as we can, but again, there's a lot of information to cover. Thanks for joining me. God bless you. Have a great and wonderful day in the Lord, and continue to serve him throughout this week. And remember, it's Advent. You serve the Christ of faith, hope, and love, and joy. And he reigns. He reigns. So serve him with all of your heart, with all of your mind, with all of your spirit. Chase after him with all of your strength. Because he's the Lord our God, the Messiah, the Christ. Let's worship him this Advent season and every day of every year until he comes again. Thanks for joining me. See you next time. God bless.